Welcome back to the Orchid City Zoo. Hey guys, Kingpin here. Welcome to the next episode of Sandbox mode. We're getting incredibly close to being done with the Africa pack. Matter of fact, we only have one animal left. So far, we've made 3 habitats for 3 incredible animals, both large and small. At the Orchid City Zoo, we try to make the most realistic and detailed exhibits. And don't think for a second that this stops just at the exterior. The interiors matter just as much. Backstage areas are crucial to observe animals in a much more controlled environment, and to be able to get them out of the guest's prying eye. Our animals don't like to hide behind the scenes very often, though. They would much rather spend their time growing and learning in their habitats that aim to simulate their natural habitat as accurately as possible. Our animals have endless amounts of stimulation, enrichment, and entertainment inside of their habitats. There truly is never a dull moment for our animals here at the Orchid City Zoo, and I hope you enjoy it. Progress at the Orchid City Zoo is coming along incredibly efficiently and very well, but what's progress if progress doesn't grow? Allow me to introduce you to Savanna at Dusk, our latest and newest habitat that's currently under construction. As the name implies, Savanna at Dusk is an African-themed night hike. This focuses on nocturnal animals, which means the interior of the habitat is very dark, and we have room for 4 species in here. In the last episode, we added the first of the 4 species, meaning we're 25% of the way done. In between episodes, I learned how to mess around with the lighting a lot, so now we can truly see what it looks like with the lights off. You're gonna have to watch your step in here, cause it is pretty dark, but this is exactly what the animals that are nocturnal want. Despite being by far our biggest and most ambitious project yet, so far Savanna at Dusk is only home to 1 aardvark. She's incredibly friendly, and aardvarks are solitary animals, so she doesn't mind the loneliness at all. If you have any name suggestions for her, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Today we have 2 chambers to complete for Savanna at Dusk. We have a backstage on the left, and the next animal is going to be in this bigger one on the right. Since this is officially open to the public, I also wouldn't mind some interior detail as well. If you liked today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. You're more than welcome in this wonderful community we're growing. Likely spoiled by the title of the video or the thumbnail itself, the Orchid City Zoo's newest member is going to be the adorable Fennec Fox. Let's check what they're going to need. This is another savanna-dwelling species native to North Africa, so I doubt they're going to want many plants. It also says right here that they only need 182 square meters of space. That's really small and should make them easy to build for. We have 4 of these adorable creatures coming to the Orchid City Zoo, so it looks like that meets all of the social requirements. There's just going to be an alpha male and female. The Fennec Foxes look to have a pretty complex diet filled with a lot of variety in their foods. We might have to accommodate this in their habitat. Lastly, it doesn't appear that they have any cohabitation. Unfortunately for us, it looks like our Fennec Foxes have arrived at the Orchid City Zoo a little bit early, and they're currently waiting in the trade center to be put in their habitat. That means we're going to have to work on the backstage first today. Excluding the Horn Research Facility, this is one of our larger backstage areas because it's shared between the Foxes and the aardvark exhibit. I want to start the backstage off with what's likely going to be its defining feature, the Fennec Fox enclosure that's right in the middle of it. This is actually going to be incredibly similar to our very first habitat in the zoo. In the last episode, we went over how to make these mesh barriers geometrically perfect. Today we're going to be more so focusing on how to actually detail it up once you have the barrier complete. So if you find yourself not able to make a perfect square or rectangle, feel free to check out that episode first. Anyways, what I like to do first with any good backstage is get the floor in. One tip that you might not have heard before is that just because the path isn't technically visible doesn't mean that staff or guests can't walk on it, so feel free to put roof pieces right over the path to make it look nicer. Now that the flooring is completely done, and we have the rough outline of our backstage exhibit for the foxes, we need to figure out where the zookeepers are going to be able to actually get in the exhibit from. Sadly, this door isn't going to be functional, it's just for show. Only habitat gates can actually be used by staff in this game. This doesn't really bother me though, because my main goal for these builds is to be as realistic as possible. And realistically speaking, there probably would be an entrance to the backstage from the backstage. If you know anything about mesh in real life, you'll know that it's not particularly strong. It's quite flimsy actually, so it needs a lot of support from other objects like these wooden posts. After finding a good spot to place the first one, we can simply use the X and the Z axis to make the other corners perfectly aligned. After placing the last wooden post, I then go to the Advanced Movement menu and rotate it 90 degrees along the Z-axis. Then I can go back to the other movement menus and raise it perfectly along the now X-axis and get a perfect trim around the top. Mastering and using the Advanced Movement menus is truly the only way you can get your builds to look absolutely perfect. There's something just so satisfying about when all of the angles line up perfectly. I'm really glad we got this out of the way first. I'm happy with how it turned out, but now we can focus on a lot of the smaller details. Backstage detailing can be a little bit tricky. Like we said in the last episode, you almost want it to purposefully look messy. This is something I want to improve on, so let's give it a shot. One thing I like to do in Backstage is actually reusing assets from other areas in the zoo. I actually think this makes your zoos and builds more realistic, because realistically speaking, a zoo isn't going to have 20 different designs for shelves, they're going to buy them all from the same provider. This is because the public doesn't actually see backstage areas, only the staff. So yes, it's really good that every single habitat looks different from the outside. It's completely okay if your backstages look a little similar and even reuse the same objects. It just means it's the same level of quality throughout the whole zoo. Just because you're reusing a lot of assets doesn't mean you can't have any new ideas, though. I really like this design. We can study any offspring we get in here. Just because you're reusing the base of something doesn't necessarily mean it has to be completely identical to what's beside it. For example, on these shelves, we can simply change what's on them. This helps make the build look more dynamic. Animals don't eat the exact same thing every day in a zoo. Try to mix up what their diet might entail. I think it would be cool if we put a box right here, right next to the door. Maybe this is the thing that's going to go into the habitat next. Speaking of going to the habitat next, maybe we can have an empty crate for now and put an enrichment item for our aardvark in here. Just because these animals are at home in the heat and humidity doesn't necessarily mean our staff is. I actually really liked how that enrichment toy crate turned out, so let's make a few more of them for our Fennec Foxes. We built this perfectly on the grid, so it was really easy to change up the color exactly where I wanted it in the habitat. I think this looks good. At least our Fennec Foxes are going to have a nice area to stay while we finish the rest. This next part won't be very hard at all. All we have to do is put a roof on, and then make an air conditioning unit. The roof couldn't have been easier, it's just like we did with the floor. Actually, detailing the roof was a little bit more challenging. Luckily, we already had these air conditioning vents designed from our time at Asia Quest. I like to try and make these as realistic as possible as well, so what I'll typically do with them is have them lead on one side of the wall to this part, and then I'll have a heater or air conditioning unit on the other side that actually provides realistic airflow. The backstage is officially done, everything from the interior to the exterior. I've gotta say, this one room specifically is probably my favorite part of the zoo so far. We also accomplished our goal of already having a spot for our Fennec Foxes to go while construction begins on their habitat. I think this error came down to simple zoo staff miscommunication. This happens. Luckily, everything turned out alright this time, but we should probably make an extra large staff room just so our staff is more well rested to avoid this error from ever happening again. Despite all the crazy amounts of construction happening right outside her habitat, our aardvark managed to stay asleep the entire time. Once she wakes up from her nap, we'll be sure to pick a good name from the comments for her, so stay tuned. Speaking of our aardvark, I ultimately cut it from the video, but we did reorganize the back a little bit, including the aardvark's outdoor portion of her exhibit. Now that construction has quieted down, and it won't hurt our Fennec Fox's very sensitive ears, let's go bring them to their new home. I need the name of the keeper that was able to wrangle the 4 of these guys back here, because they definitely deserve a raise. Hopefully they'll go down for a nap soon. My plans for this habitat are incredibly vague. It's more so a big picture and the details will come later, which is usually the opposite of how I plan. With our aardvarks not liking sand near as much as I thought they would, I was pleased to see that the Fennec Foxes acquired a fair amount of it. To make this habitat a little bit more dynamic and interesting, and make it look like it's more than just a pile of sand, I added in 2 types of sand, and even the 2 types of soil in various patches. I also was sure to add a little bit of height variation. I made some low ground on the right, and some high ground on the left, which we'll get to in a second. The Fennec Foxes are so small though, I couldn't go too crazy. The high ground was a bit challenging for this exhibit, but one thing I knew going in is I don't want any of the African plaster to be showing in the final product. Most of this rock is eventually going to be covered up by other rocks. I think that's the exact effect I was trying to sell. Now to do something about those ugly plaster walls in the exhibit. I found this really cool design on the workshop using the stalactite pieces and some roots. I really like it, but I want to try to make my own. I knew this was going to be a little tougher than I expected, when I couldn't even figure out the right color for a while. Eventually, after I found a color I was happy with, I duplicated the object, rotated it 180 degrees, and put it on top of it. After that, it was simple as duplicating even more of them, and just sticking them right next to each other into a massable form. I then decided to detail up our stalactites a little bit more, adding some faux rocks and fig roots. Lastly, I decided to add a little bit of greenery to some places on these. This is simply just going to make it a lot easier to blend into the rest of the build. One down, a bunch to go. Remember, we don't want any plaster showing. This is going to be the perimeter wall. Covering up the plaster was actually a lot easier than I was expecting it to be. All I did was simply copy and paste the original asset we used and created ourselves, and then place it all over the room. Then, to avoid it from looking very similar and repetitive, also making sure it's not busting through the wall to the backstage, all I did was simply take away some of the details we already added. Obviously we can't copy and paste throughout the entire build, because there are some areas, like the corners, that are a little bit smaller. Covering up the walls got a little bit tedious, so I decided to instead divert my attention to adding some plants into the exhibit first. One of the defining features of a desert or a savanna is the lack of plants, or at least lush plants, so it was a little bit challenging to detail this so highly. Luckily, din grass has two variants, dry and not dry, and dry is perfect for deserts. Despite being one of the cutest animals ever, Fennec Foxes are still predators, so they're going to appreciate areas where they can hide and ambush their prey, or their enrichment items. The din grass is surprisingly tall, or maybe Fennec Foxes are just really short, who knows, but we want the guest to actually see them, so I sunk it fairly low into the ground. As I was placing the plants, I periodically went back and added a little bit more to the wall. By the time we're done, we're going to have the wall finished and the plants finished around the same time. We just have to make sure it's not bursting through the other side. Eventually, by the end, I had to start rotating our stalactite structure in some pretty odd shapes to cover all the plaster. I also wasn't careful enough, and accidentally let some of the rock work come through the wall. We have to get rid of that before we finish. With the shell of the habitat completely done, I think we can finally start adding some details that the Fennec Foxes are going to really appreciate. Let's add more plants, some enrichment items, and even some other fun things for them to play with. There is one thing that I have absolutely no plans on letting in the exhibit, and that would be the viewing audience. Sometimes they like to crash through these walls since I made it a little close to the path. Luckily these barriers will stop that from happening. Onto some enrichment items for our Fennec Foxes, and I really like the placement of this curio ball. It's going to look so cool with the lights off. This log maze is going to be very similar for what we did with our 4 meerkats. I put it right next to the window to give the guest the best possible view of when the Fennec Foxes partake in the best animation in the game. Our meerkats don't use their logs very often, so I'm assuming the foxes are going to be the same, so I put their feeder right next to the window as well. I don't like the look of having the logs just out in the open, so I want to borrow this object from our meerkat enclosure. I don't just want to plop it down right on top of it, just borrow the materials. The idea is for this to look more like a fallen tree. I don't really want it to look natural. It's going to be kind of random. One very important thing to remember when you're building for a species you've never built before is keep checking the traversable area. Some animals' hitboxes are either way too large or way too small, but these ones seem to be good. The last thing we'll do before we actually get the Fennec Foxes in their enclosure is update the education signs a little bit so the guests know exactly what's in here. For a habitat this detailed, it went surprisingly fast, but the work's just begun. So far we've neglected the outside of Savanna at Dusk. While construction begins on the viewing platforms, let's let the Fennec Foxes get accustomed to their new habitat. It's quite large since they're so small. We did in fact set up a habitat webcam in their exhibit, so curious viewers at home can get a sneak peek before the exhibit opens. It looks like our aardvark is finally awake. I'd like everybody to welcome Alicia to the zoo. And thank you, James, for the name suggestion. If you'd like a chance to be in the next video, leave a comment for one of our 4 Fennec Foxes, 2 male and 2 female. Just like Alicia the aardvark, Fennec Foxes are nocturnal, and I'm trying to make this as dark as possible, and luckily I finally figured out a good strategy. I actually double layered the roof. The lighting in this game is overall incredibly good, but sometimes it can be difficult to make things dark. Now we're going to put a second layer on. This is about as bright as it's going to get in here. I really like the effects. Switching over to a little live commentary, we're at the guest point of view right now, about as tall as they're going to be, and so far I really like how everything's coming together. The viewing areas look perfect so far from a height perspective. Obviously we still have to detail them a lot. Let's work on that now. I was going to have all the Fennec Foxes back in the backstage for the construction so their ears wouldn't get hurt, but to be honest I don't think they really mind right now. The first thing I want to do is get the lighting effects correct, and we're just going to simply borrow the lights from our aardvark enclosure. We're going to put them in areas where the guests aren't going to be able to see them, and the lights have a red tint to give a really cool nighttime effect. Now this is what I had in mind. If you were ever curious as to why it was called Savanna at dusk, I hope this answers your questions. It's really dark in here. Luckily, this is exactly what our Fennec Foxes want. They're right at home. Our guests, however, don't feel right at home. So far, the exterior of the Fennec Fox enclosure is pretty bare. Let's get to work on that, and maybe add one more animal while we're at it. When building on the grid, sometimes it can get a little finicky if you have a roof in place, and it jumps around a lot of different camera angles, so for now we're temporarily going to get rid of it. We have 3 exhibits ready to go, and they're in the correct location. We're going to be doing one per episode, starting right now. I decided to use this circular plaster piece to make it a little bit more interesting of the viewing window. I also extended the floor all the way out to where we're going to finish building today, just to give myself a little visual indicator. I didn't realize until now that we actually only have one other exhibit animal in the zoo, our Malaysian leafbug over in Asia Quest. But to buy an exhibit animal, it's the exact same process as what you'd do for a habitat animal, and to place it, it's also the exact same. Just place it in the exhibit you want. We chose the desert horned viper, and as you can see we have a nice pre-built exhibit. I really like the facade. You can then go into the menu and place a lot of enrichment items for him. In franchise mode you'll have to research to unlock these, but in this you don't. Then just set the humidity and temperature right. You are quite possibly one of the most intimidating animals I have ever seen. You're just sitting there so menacingly. Since we got the design right on the very first try, I figured I would simply copy and paste it to the other 2 exhibits. We're gonna do those in the next 2 episodes. I also decided to get our female desert horned viper a male counterpart. Let's send him to the exhibit right now and hopefully they can get acquainted. I feel like exhibit animals of any kind are really underrated and underappreciated in this game. Now that the big grid pieces are placed around the exhibits, we can finally close up the roof. A good and helpful tip to when you're building is after you finish something kind of major, shrink down to about the guest perspective and just walk around a little bit. This will make it a lot easier to spot any mistakes or holes you made. Like right here, right in the corner of this exhibit. I have a plan for how to fix that, but first I want to place this exhibit education board right outside of our desert horned viper. They're basically the same as the habitat ones. The last thing that we're going to do to the exterior of the exhibit is add a lot of wood trims everywhere, and this is incredibly easy, but it makes all of the difference. Literally, all I'm doing is adding this Planet Zoo beam, duplicating it once, and then putting this absolutely everywhere. The sheer amount of detail you can get from one simple object and just placing that a lot is so understated it's not even funny. A lot of beginner builders don't realize this and think that their details have to be absolutely extravagant, but it truly is the simple ones that make a build look so much more professional and refined. Doing this adds 2 things to a build, and they're 2 of the most critical important aspects of details you can possibly have. The first one is depth. It makes your builds look a lot more dynamic and less flat. And the second one is color change. Nobody wants to look at a boring gray plaster wall, but having the wood here makes it a lot more interesting, despite it being so simple. This also makes your other aspects pop a lot more. Now that the wood is here, it really highlights our aardvark education board and our Fennec Fox education board, for example. This makes your other details look even better. Switching back over to live commentary, let's tour what we've done so far. Entering from the side will get you right to Alicia, and she's right there. Looks like she's sleeping on her favorite little spot. She's here frequently. Despite it being night and her being nocturnal, she's still asleep. Now let's take the path back, looping around to our meerkat enclosure to go into the main entrance of Savanna at dusk. This is where a majority of the guests are going to enter. Alicia's just special and has her own separate wing. The entrance is incredibly well done. I really like the murals and the plant life on the walls here. It's one of my favorite little portions of the build, with that iconic wood trim that's going around the entire thing. As soon as you enter the main aspect of the building, you'll see our desert horned viper on the left. There's two of them in here, a male and a female, but they're not going to have names. This is Alicia's main viewing portion. And where did she go? That's actually kind of frightening, we were just over there. There she is. Must have gotten thirsty. Matter of fact, it looks like somebody's gonna go check on her now. That looks like a mechanic trying to upkeep all of the barriers to make sure nobody escapes Savanna at dusk. After such an opener with Alicia, you'd think the next exhibit would be a letdown, but in fact it's the exact opposite. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and my favorite detail by far, besides the exterior, which I think looks incredible, is the curio ball. It really makes the nighttime portion of this exhibit pop, and it looks like our Fennec Foxes like it too. Overall, I'm really happy with this area, and Savanna at dusk is progressing incredibly well. Unfortunately, it looks like the zoo is about to close, so it looks like our time here is about to come to an end today. But I had some exciting news. To celebrate the Halloween season and October, off-screen I'm going to be decorating the zoo to have an October and Halloween theme. There's also going to be a zoo tour and zoo-wide scavenger hunt coming very soon. I better get to work on that. Until then, Kingpin out. Thanks for watching!